The first time I set eyes on the cabin, I thought I had finally found my place in the world. Tucked at the edge of tall pines, with a gravel drive that wound like a secret path, it felt more like a promise than a building. A promise of peace, of freedom, of a life lived on my own terms. For years I had bounced between towns, jobs, and rentals, always answering to someone else's rules. But here was different. The cabin was mine, every creaking floorboard and weathered beam of it. Mornings started slow. I'd step out onto the porch with a mug of steaming coffee, the mist still curling low over the trees. Birds chattered from the branches, a woodpecker hammering somewhere far off. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost believe the rest of the world didn't exist. The neighbors were far enough away that I rarely saw them unless I went looking, and even then, most were polite enough to give a nod and keep walking. It was quiet. It was mine. That peace lasted just long enough to trick me into thinking it might stay that way forever. The first letter came folded neatly in my mailbox, printed on heavy paper with a polished header that read, "Welcome to the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association." It looked official, though it hadn't been more than a week since I'd moved in, and I hadn't signed up for anything beyond the closing paperwork with the county clerk. Still, I figured it was some kind of neighborly gesture, maybe a guide to trash pickup days or a note about local events. But when I unfolded it, the tone was less welcome and more warning. Dear homeowner, please be advised that Pine Ridge is a covenant-protected community. As such, we have a shared responsibility to uphold community standards. All properties are expected to maintain appearances in accordance with HOA guidelines. It went on, a page full of rules about paint colors, lawn care, and something called architectural conformity. At the bottom, in tidy cursive, was the signature of the HOA president, Carla Henderson. At first, I laughed. My cabin was half a mile from the main road, hidden behind trees. Who in their right mind would care what color I painted it? But tucked into the letter was a fine print clause, something about annual dues and enforcement. That was the first time I felt the sting of unease. I hadn't bought into any HOA. My paperwork never mentioned one. Yet here was this woman claiming jurisdiction over my property as if it were hers. I crumpled the letter and tossed it on the counter. Not my problem, I muttered. But of course, it was. The next week, I found another envelope waiting for me. This one wasn't a general welcome. It was a friendly reminder, bold letters across the top. Apparently, my mailbox, an old wooden post I had patched together myself, was non-compliant. It didn't match the community's standard black metal boxes with reflective numbers. I remember standing there in the driveway, letter in one hand, looking at that mailbox like it had personally betrayed me. It was sturdy. It worked. The mail fit. Why did it matter what color or shape it was? That was my first taste of how the HOA operated. Small bites, disguised as politeness. Not direct threats, just nudges meant to remind me I was under their eye. I fixed nothing. Soon after came the knock at my door. It was a Saturday morning, and I was fixing a loose step on the porch when I heard it, sharp, rapid, like the person on the other side had no patience for waiting. When I opened the door, there she was, Carla Henderson in the flesh. Mid-40s, short blonde bob, blazer pressed so stiff it could have stood on its own. Clipboard in hand, pen poised like a weapon. "Mr. Walker?" she asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like an accusation. "That's me," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I thought it would be best if we introduced ourselves in person." Her eyes swept over my porch, my yard, the stack of lumber by the shed. I could practically hear her making a mental list of offenses. "You received our letters, I assume?" "I did." "And? And what?" I asked. Her smile was tight, humorless. "And will you be bringing your property into compliance?" I almost laughed in her face. "This is my property, ma'am. As long as the county's happy, I don't see why you should care how I keep it." Her pen scribbled something on the clipboard. "Pine Ridge has standards, Mr. Walker. Standards that protect property values and preserve harmony among neighbors. Non-compliance creates problems for everyone, Well, Carla, I said, letting her name roll heavy off my tongue. The only problem I see is someone knocking on my door, telling me what color my mailbox should be. Her eyes narrowed. We'll be in touch. And just like that, she turned on her heel and marched back down the drive. From that moment on, the piece I'd loved so much about the cabin started to crack. It was little things at first. A car slowing whenever it passed my gate. A neighbor who used to wave now crossing the street without looking at me. Another letter about unsightly wood storage. A notice claiming my grass was overgrown, though it barely brushed my ankles. It was harassment dressed up in legal language, and every time I crumpled a letter or tossed it aside, another would appear, more pointed than the last. At night, I'd sit on the porch listening to the crickets and wondering how long it would go on. Part of me wanted to believe it would blow over, that Carlo would find some other poor soul to badger. But the bigger part knew better. Bullies don't stop when you ignore them. They just push harder. One evening, Greg, the neighbor from across the road, wandered over while I was stacking firewood. He was a quiet man, wiry, with a permanent squint like the sun was always in his eyes. Word of advice, he said, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Best to just play along. Change the mailbox. Cut the grass a little shorter. Makes life easier. I looked at him, sweat dripping down my temples, the weight of a log in my arms. Easier for who? He shrugged. For everyone. Carla doesn't like outliers. Outliers. That word stuck with me long after he walked back across the road. I hadn't come here to blend in or match the paint swatches in some hoe binder. I'd come here because I wanted space to breathe, to live how I chose. But already I could feel the noose tightening. Every letter, every knock, every disapproving glance, it was building towards something. I just didn't know what. Not yet, but I would soon. And when it came, I'd realize that those first letters, those first warnings, weren't annoyances at all. They were the opening shots in a war I never asked for. A war that would push me further than I ever thought I'd go. A war that would begin with a realtor on my driveway and end with a locked gate, a painted sign, and a neighborhood that would never forget my name. The weeks that followed Carla's visit were like water dripping onto stone. Small, constant, never enough to break me outright, but always there, wearing me down. I'd wake up in the mornings to find another letter in my mailbox. Sometimes it was folded neatly into an envelope, stamped with that pristine hoe letterhead. Other times it was slipped under my door, as if someone had gone out of their way to make sure I couldn't miss it. One letter said my grass exceeded the community length requirement by an inch. Another claimed that the lumber I kept stacked by the shed was unsightly. One even scolded me for leaving my trash bin visible from the road on a non-pickup day. It was as though Carla had appointed herself the sheriff of my property, patrolling with binoculars and a clipboard. At first, I ignored them, tossing the papers into a growing pile on the counter. But that pile grew fast, and every time I saw it, my stomach knotted. They weren't just pieces of paper. They were reminders that I was being watched, that every step I took on my land was being measured against a set of rules I never agreed to. The strangest part was how quickly the neighborhood's attitude toward me shifted. When I first moved in, people smiled and waved. Some even stopped by to introduce themselves, to ask about the cabin, to mention how peaceful the area was. But after Carla's letters started piling up, the smiles faded. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly busied themselves with their gardens when I drove past. A couple who had once asked if I wanted to join their Sunday barbecue now avoided eye contact entirely. It was as if my refusal to bend to Carla's rules had branded me an outcast. One morning, I caught sight of Mrs. Ellison, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, walking her terrier along the road. I raised a hand to greet her like I always had, but she turned her face sharply, tugging the dog along as though I were invisible. My hand hovered in the air, awkward and heavy, before I let it drop. That sting went deeper than I expected. I started noticing other changes too. Cars slowing down when they passed my gate. Curtains shifting when I stepped onto the porch. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps outside at night, crunching on gravel before disappearing into silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe not. Either way, the sense of being watched grew unbearable. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, Greg appeared again, leaning against the fence post at the edge of my drive. His shoulders slumped like he carried the weight of the whole community on his back. "You're making waves," he said without preamble. "Waves?" I asked, gripping the handle of the axe I'd been using to split wood. "Carla doesn't like resistance," he said, voice low. "And when Carla doesn't like something, neither does the board. You ignore her long enough, she'll make it harder for you. Fines, meetings, maybe even liens." The word hit me like a rock. Liens. The idea that someone like Carla could reach into my life and slap a claim on my cabin, it churned my stomach. "You sound like you've been through this before," I said. Greg gave a humorless laugh. "Everyone has. Some just give in sooner." He looked at me hard. "Word of advice? Pick your battles. Sometimes it's easier to just paint the mailbox." He left before I could answer, shuffling back across the road like a man resigned to chains he couldn't break. I stood there long after he was gone, the axe hanging useless in my hands, wondering if he was right. But every time I thought about caving in, about repainting my mailbox or cutting my grass an inch shorter just to keep Carla quiet, anger surged up in me. I hadn't worked half my life to buy a piece of land only to let some neighbor with a clipboard dictate how I lived on it. Still, Carla's presence loomed larger each day. She wasn't content with letters anymore. She started showing up unannounced, walking the road in front of my cabin with her clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes scanning my property like a hawk circling prey. Once, I caught her standing just beyond the gate, scribbling notes while staring at my woodpile. I stepped out onto the porch and called. "See something you like?" She jumped slightly, then plastered on that tight smile of hers. "Just routine observation. Nothing to worry about." "Then why does it look like you're casing the place?" Her smile thinned. "Careful, Mr. Walker. Hostility isn't a good look in this community." I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles went white, but I forced myself to stay silent. That was her game. Bait me into saying something she could twist against me. She left soon after, her heels crunching on the gravel, but I couldn't shake the image of her smirk as she walked away. The next letter I received wasn't like the others. It was shorter, almost gleeful in its wording. "Failure to resolve outstanding violations may result in fines and further enforcement actions, including, but not limited to, legal proceedings." Legal proceedings. The words gnawed at me. I read them again and again, the letters blurring together until my vision swam. I paced the cabin, restless, the walls closing in. I hadn't done anything wrong. My grass wasn't hurting anyone. My woodpile wasn't some public menace. And yet, here I was, being threatened with legal action by a group of people I never asked to be a part of. The worst part was the silence of the others. Neighbors who'd once greeted me now acted like I was diseased. Some of them must have known Carla was going too far, but none spoke up. None wanted to be the next target. That isolation burrowed deep into me. I found myself second-guessing everything I did. Should I leave the porch light on at night? Would that be deemed excessive illumination? Could I chop wood on a Sunday? Or would that be noise disturbance? Living in the cabin was supposed to be freedom, but under Carla's watchful eye, it was starting to feel like a cage. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table with the pile of letters spread out before me, I caught myself whispering, "What do they want from me?" The answer came a week later. I pulled into the drive after a long day in town and noticed something strange. A car I didn't recognize was parked by the gate, engine still running. A woman in a blazer stood beside it, flipping through a folder. I slowed to a crawl, suspicion prickling the back of my neck. She looked up, startled, then smiled too quickly. "Oh, hello. You must be the owner. I'm with Evergreen Realty. I'm just here to show the property to a potential buyer." The words hit me like a punch. "Buyer?" "Yes," she said brightly. "This cabin is listed as for sale. Didn't you know?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My pulse thundered in my ears. No, I hadn't known. because it wasn't for sale. And in that moment, I understood exactly what Carla wanted. Not compliance, not conformity. She wanted me gone. The woman at the gate kept smiling, but I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes when I didn't answer her right away. I shut off the truck and climbed out slowly, boots crunching against gravel. "This property isn't for sale," I said flatly. She blinked, the smile faltering just enough to reveal cracks. I was told otherwise. I was contacted by the Homeowners Association. They said they were authorized to have me tour it with clients. My fists clenched. "The Carla. Of course. Let me make this clear," I said, stepping closer until my shadow stretched long across the dirt. "This cabin belongs to me. No one, no association, no board, no neighbor has the right to put it on the market." The realtor shifted uncomfortably, tucking the folder under her arm like a shield. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I'm just doing my job. If there's a misunderstanding, maybe we should talk to the HOA president." "Carla?" I spat her name like poison. "I'll be talking to her all right. But you're trespassing. Turn your car around and leave before I call the sheriff." Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she'd argue. But something in my tone must have convinced her otherwise. She mumbled an apology, slid into her car, and drove off down the road without looking back. I stood there, watching the dust settle, heart hammering. My blood boiled at the audacity of it all. Listing my home for sale without my consent wasn't just harassment. It was a declaration of war. That night, I barely slept. I kept pacing the cabin, every creak of the floorboards echoing like footsteps. I pictured Carla at her desk, smugly signing papers, telling herself she was in control. I pictured my neighbors whispering behind curtains, waiting to see if I'd fold or fight. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out my old pad of plywood from the shed, grabbed a bucket of red paint, and spent the next hour crafting a sign big enough that no one could mistake its meaning. The letters were thick and uneven, but bold. "Not for sale. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." When it dried, I carried it down to the gate, hammering it into the ground where no one could miss it. The sound of each nail slamming into wood echoed in my chest like the pounding of war drums. I stood back and looked at it, crude maybe, but it was my line in the sand. The first reaction came sooner than expected. Around noon, as I sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee, Carla herself appeared at the edge of the road. She wore her usual crisp blouse and tailored skirt, clipboard in hand like always. But her smile was sharper today, her eyes glittering with something almost triumphant. Well, she said, voice dripping honey. "I see you've taken creative measures. Stay off my land, Carla." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you mean. I was just taking my daily walk." Imagine my surprise when I saw such a hostile sign greeting the neighborhood. Hostile? That's rich coming from you. "You tried to sell my house out from under me." She didn't flinch, didn't deny it either. Instead, she tapped her clipboard with a manicured finger. "We all have responsibilities to this community, Mr. Walker. You, unfortunately, have been neglecting yours. Sometimes drastic action is necessary." "Drastic action? You call forging a sale responsibility?" She smiled thinly. "I didn't forge anything. I simply explored options. If this property is too much for you to handle, perhaps someone else, someone who values harmony, would be better suited to it." Her words struck like knives, but beneath my fury was a flicker of something colder. Fear. If she could contact realtors, list my place without permission, what else was she capable of? "You're insane," I said. "And if you or anyone else steps 1 foot past that gate again, I'll have the sheriff out here before you can blink." For the first time, her smile faltered. Just a crack, but enough to reveal the steel beneath. "Careful," she said softly. "Threats can be misinterpreted." With that, she turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the pavement, each step like a hammer driving home the truth. This wasn't going to stop. The next few days blurred into a tense waiting game. I worked around the cabin, but every noise set me on edge. A car slowing near the gate, voices drifting down the road. At night, I caught the faint glow of flashlights in the distance, though whenever I stepped outside, the lights vanished into the trees. One evening, as the crickets chirped and the woods settled into night, a knock echoed on my door. My stomach dropped. I opened it cautiously to find Greg standing there, face pale under the porch light. "She's telling people you're dangerous," he said without preamble. "That you threatened her. That she's worried about her safety." My jaw tightened. "She came onto my property. She's the one pushing me." "I know," Greg said, running a hand through his graying hair. "But she's twisting the story. And people believe her. They're saying maybe the board should vote to escalate. Legal action. Maybe even a sheriff's order to force compliance." My chest felt like it was caving in. Over grass? Over a woodpile? Greg gave me a look that was almost pity. "It's not about the rules. It never is. It's about control. Carla doesn't lose battles. She'll bleed you dry before she lets that happen." Something in his tone told me he wasn't exaggerating. "Then I'll fight," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. Greg sighed, staring out into the darkness. "I hope you know what that means." After he left, I sat at the table staring at the pile of violation letters. They blurred together under the dim lamp, a sea of threats dressed up as official notices. I thought about calling a lawyer, but the cost alone made my head ache. Besides, what could I even say? My HOA president tried to sell my house. It sounded insane, like the ranting of a paranoid man. But then I remembered the realtor at the gate, folder in hand, smiling as she told me the cabin was listed. That wasn't paranoia. That was proof. The next morning, I drove into town, every mile heavy with dread. I walked into the sheriff's office, clutching the photo I'd taken of the realtor's car plate before she sped away. The deputy at the desk gave me a skeptical look as I explained, but he dutifully wrote it down. "HOAs can be tricky," he said finally. "They've got a lot of power in these parts. But listing your property without your consent? That's serious. I'll pass this up the chain." His words should have comforted me, but all I felt was the uneasy weight of being caught between two forces, a system stacked in Carla's favor, and a fight I couldn't afford to lose. When I returned to the cabin, the sign at the gate was gone, snapped off its post, lying face down in the dirt like a fallen soldier. And tacked to the gate in its place was a fresh letter, the ink crisp and bold. "Cease and desist. All unauthorized signage must be removed. Further noncompliance will result in immediate board action." I stood there, the letter flapping in the breeze, rage and fear battling in my chest. Carla hadn't just ignored my line in the sand. She'd crossed it, torn it down, and replaced it with her own. The war had officially begun. The morning after I found my sign torn down, the cabin no longer felt like my refuge. Every creak of the wood, every sway of the trees outside reminded me that the ground beneath me wasn't steady anymore. The HOA had made their move, and Carla had made it clear she wasn't backing down. I spent the day on edge, waiting for the next blow. It came in the form of a thick envelope slid under my door. The paper was heavier than the usual notices, the kind of weight that carried authority. I tore it open and scanned the contents. My pulse quickened with every line. It was a formal notice of legal action. The HOA board claimed I was in violation of multiple bylaws, citing everything from failure to maintain landscaping in accordance with community standards to erection of unauthorized signage. They demanded immediate compliance, or they would begin proceedings to place a lien on my property, my cabin, my land, the one place I had thought untouchable. The room seemed to tilt. I sat heavily in the chair by the window, the papers trembling in my hands. A lien meant they could tie up my home in courts, drag me through months of legal hell, maybe even force a sale if fines piled up. Carla wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was laying siege. I shoved the papers aside, anger building like a storm. She wanted to scare me, wanted me to roll over, to pack up and leave so she could claim another victory. Not this time. That evening, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My stomach clenched as a sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the gate. The deputy from before stepped out, adjusting his hat, his expression unreadable. "Evening, Mr. Walker," he called. I met him at the gate, arms crossed. "Let me guess, Carla called you." He sighed. "She filed a complaint. Says you threatened her. Says you're creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood." I barked a humorless laugh. "Hostile? She's the one trespassing, tearing down my signs, listing my property for sale without permission." His eyes flickered, but his tone stayed measured. "Look, I'm not here to take sides, but I have to follow up. Mind telling me your version?" I explained everything. The letters, the realtor, the destroyed sign. I even showed him the photo of the license plate, the pile of notices on my table, the fresh legal threat. He listened, nodding slowly, jotting down notes in his pad. When I finished, he closed the notebook with a snap. "Here's the thing. HOAs operate in a gray area. They've got their own rules, their own boards, sometimes even their own legal teams. But listing your house without your consent? That's not gray. That's fraud. Keep that photo. Keep every notice. If this goes to court, you'll need it." His words steadied me a little. Proof mattered. Paper trails mattered. But when he drove off, the night felt heavier than before. Because even with the law on my side, I knew Carla had the neighborhood behind her. The proof came the next day. I was chopping wood out back when voices drifted across the trees. Two neighbors, standing by the road, talking loud enough that I couldn't miss it. "Reckless, that's what he is. You heard what Carla said. Man's a danger to the community. If the board's taking action, it's for good reason." Their words stung more than I wanted to admit. These were the same people who once waved at me, who once welcomed me. Now they saw me as the villain, a threat to their precious harmony. By evening, it wasn't just whispers. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, neatly typed with the whole letterhead. "Community alert. Ongoing violations by Mr. Walker. The HOA is pursuing necessary action to protect our neighborhood's safety and standards. We ask for your patience and support during this process." Safety. They made me sound like a criminal. I crumpled the flyer in my fist, heat rising in my chest. Carla was poisoning the well, turning everyone against me so that when she struck harder, no one would question it. The isolation deepened. When I drove into town, I felt eyes following me. At the diner, conversations hushed when I walked in. The cashier at the hardware store avoided small talk, sliding my receipt across the counter without meeting my gaze. I was no longer just a neighbor. I was an outcast. One night, the tension finally boiled over. I heard shouting outside and rushed to the porch. Greg was there, standing in the road with Carla and two other board members. Their voices carried through the still night air. "This has gone too far," Greg was saying, his tone strained. "You can't just run a man out because you don't like how he stacks his firewood." Carla's reply was ice. "Greg, you know as well as I do that standards exist for a reason. If he can't respect them, he doesn't belong here." I leaned on the railing, watching, listening. Greg's shoulders slumped. "You'll ruin him." Carla's smile was sharp. He ruined himself the moment he refused to cooperate. When she noticed me standing there, her smile widened. "Ah, speak of the devil. Mr. Walker, care to join the conversation?" I didn't answer. I just stared, my silence louder than any words I could have spoken. Eventually, they left, their voices fading into the dark. But the damage lingered. Later, Greg knocked on my door, looking weary. "She's tightening the noose," he said. "Once the board votes, they'll hit you with fines so steep you won't know which way's up. And if you can't pay." He trailed off, eyes heavy with unspoken truth. I knew what he meant. If I couldn't pay, they'd come for the cabin. That night, I sat at the tables surrounded by papers, the violation notices, the legal threats, the sheriff's notes. I felt like a man preparing for battle, but my weapons were nothing but ink and paper. I thought about giving in, just for a moment. Maybe if I paid a fine, trimmed the grass, painted the mailbox, Carla would ease off. Maybe the neighbors would stop glaring. Maybe I could have peace again. But then I remembered the realtor at the gate. the sign ripped down, the smug glint in Carla's eyes. This wasn't about grass. This wasn't about rules. This was about ownership, about control, about power. And if I surrendered now, I'd never get it back. So I made a decision. The next morning, I drove into town, past the diner, past the hardware store, all the way to the law office near the courthouse. The lawyer inside was a sharp-eyed man with graying hair who listened quietly as I laid everything out. The letters, the realtor, the sheriff's notes, the destroyed sign. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You've got a case," he said. "Maybe even a strong one. Fraud, harassment, abuse of power. The problem is, HOAs fight dirty. They've got money, they've got lawyers, and they count on wearing you down. If you're serious about this, you'd better be ready for a long fight." I nodded, though my throat felt dry. How long? Months? Maybe years? The weight of that answer pressed down on me, but beneath it all was a spark. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone was telling me I had a chance. When I left the office, the sun was high, the air sharp with autumn chill. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. But as I pulled into my drive, I noticed something that sent the steadiness crumbling. A car sat idling by the gate. Inside were two strangers, staring at the cabin like it was already theirs. One held a flyer, the same flyer Carla had sent around the neighborhood. When they noticed me, they drove off, dust kicking up in their wake. And tacked to the gate, where my sign once stood, was another notice, the ink bold and unyielding. HOA board meeting scheduled. Agenda: enforcement action against Mr. Walker's property. The date was set for 3 days away. Carla wasn't waiting for courts. She was rallying her army. The 3 days leading up to the board meeting felt like waiting for a storm I couldn't escape. The notice on my gate had spread quickly. By the next morning, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. I could feel it in the way cars slowed when they passed my driveway, in the clusters of people whispering by their mailboxes. Everyone knew, and everyone was picking a side. Greg stopped by once, standing stiffly in my yard like a man walking a tightrope. "It's not going to be fair," he warned. "Carla controls the board. She controls the votes. They'll stack the deck against you. Then why even hold the meeting?" I asked bitterly. "Because they want to show," Greg said. "They want to humiliate you, make an example out of you so no one else thinks about pushing back." That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of letters, legal notices, and notes I'd taken after talking to the deputy and the lawyer. I felt like a soldier sharpening dull weapons before a battle he couldn't afford to lose. By the time the day arrived, I hadn't slept more than a few hours in a row. My hands shook as I buttoned a clean shirt, the kind I hadn't worn since before this nightmare began. The meeting was held in the community center, a squat brick building near the lake that usually hosted potlucks and bake sales. Tonight, though, it looked like an arena. The parking lot was full. The lights blazed. People streamed in, dressed sharp, clutching clipboards or folded arms, their voices buzzing with anticipation. I pulled in last, my truck rumbling loud in the tense silence. Heads turned as I parked. Conversations hushed. It was like stepping into the lion's den. Inside, the room was set up with rows of folding chairs, all facing a long table at the front where the board sat. Carla was in the center, flanked by 2 other members, her posture perfect, her smile sharp. She looked like a queen on her throne. Greg sat off to the side, avoiding my eyes, his face lined with worry. I took a seat in the back, papers clutched tight in my hands. The air was hot, heavy with perfume, cologne, and the faint tang of hostility. Carla tapped her gavel against the table. The chatter died instantly. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Tonight's meeting will address an important matter concerning one of our residents, Mr. Walker, and his continued violations of community standards." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I could feel eyes on me, sharp as daggers. Carla continued, flipping through her clipboard with exaggerated precision. "Over the past several months, Mr. Walker has repeatedly failed to comply with basic maintenance requirements. He has erected unauthorized signage, displayed hostility toward board members, and created an unsafe atmosphere for our community. Unsafe. She said it so casually, but the word struck me like a stone. Unsafe wasn't just about grass or signs. Unsafe meant dangerous. Criminal. I shot to my feet. That's a lie. Dozens of heads swiveled toward me. Carla's smile never faltered. Mr. Walker, you will have your chance to speak. Please sit. I hesitated, heat rushing up my neck, but forced myself back into the chair. She wanted me to explode. Wanted me to confirm her narrative. She began reading off violations one by one, her tone smug, her eyes flicking toward the crowd as though each line was another nail in my coffin. A neighbor chimed in now and then, complaining about noise, about smoke from my chimney, about how unfriendly I had become. It was all twisted truth, half-truth, or outright lies. But together it built a case that painted me as the villain. Finally, Carla set down her papers and folded her hands. Given the severity of these ongoing issues, the board recommends immediate fines totaling $4,500. Failure to pay within 30 days will result in a lien being placed on the property, with further steps pursued as necessary. The room buzzed with approval. Heads nodded. A few people even clapped softly. I stood again, my voice steady despite the fire in my chest. You're leaving out the part where you invited a realtor to sell my house without my consent. You're leaving out the part where you tore down my sign, trespassed on my land, and lied about me threatening you. A hush fell. Carla's smile tightened, just a fraction. That's a serious accusation, she said smoothly. Do you have proof? I held up the photo of the realtor's car, the plate number clear against the sunlit road. This woman showed up at my gate with papers, claiming my cabin was listed. She said she was contacted by this board, and I've got the sheriff's deputy who wrote it down. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, uncertainty flashing across their faces. Carla's eyes narrowed, but her voice stayed calm. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Realtors often canvass properties. Don't lie, I snapped. She named you. She said the HOA sent her. The room stirred again. Greg finally stood, his voice cutting through the noise. He's telling the truth. I saw the sign myself before it was torn down. And I've watched Carla harass him day after day. The murmur of dissent rose. Carla banged the gavel sharply. Order. Mr. Walker is not on trial here to question the integrity of this board. He is here to answer for his violations, but I could see it. For the first time, cracks in her control. Some neighbors were frowning, whispering to each other. Doubt was seeping in. I stepped forward, holding my stack of notices high. This isn't about grass or mailboxes. This is about power. About Carla deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be any one of you. The words hung in the air. Some people looked away, shame flickering across their faces. Others scowled, unwilling to hear it. Carla slammed the gavel again, her smile gone now. Enough. The board has made its decision. Fines will stand. If Mr. Walker refuses to comply, the lien process will begin immediately. Applause broke out from her supporters, sharp and loud. But it wasn't unanimous. I saw Greg clapping weakly, then stopping when he noticed others staring. A handful of neighbors sat with folded arms, their faces uncertain. The meeting adjourned in a rush of voices and scraping chairs. Carla swept past me with her clipboard tucked tight under her arm, her perfume sharp as poison. She didn't look at me, but as she passed, she muttered just loud enough for me to hear. You won't win. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body trembling. Outside, the air was cool, the lake reflecting the moonlight in broken shards. People gathered in small groups, whispering, casting glances my way. I walked to my truck alone, feeling every stare burn into my back. Greg caught up just as I opened the door. She's shaken, he whispered. She's not invincible, not if you push back. But now she'll double down. She won't stop until she's got you out. I looked at him, exhaustion dragging at every word. Then I guess we keep fighting." He nodded once, then turned back toward the center, shoulders slumped. As I drove home, the road felt narrower than ever, the trees pressing in on either side. At the gate, I found another paper pinned where my sign once stood. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, scrawled in block letters. "Leave before IT gets worse." My headlights caught the ink, stark and threatening. I tore it down, my hands shaking, but the message echoed in my skull all night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The board had made their move. The neighborhood had taken sides. And now, someone out there wanted me gone badly enough to make it personal. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here. The note haunted me more than the fines, more than the Leon threat, more than Carla's smug voice echoing in that fluorescent-lit hall. Paper crumples easily in the hand, but words like that dig deep, festering in the dark. I barely slept. Every sound outside, branches snapping, an engine rumbling on the road, the distant hoot of an owl, set my nerves on edge. More than once, I got out of bed and paced from window to window, shotgun propped against my shoulder, just in case. By morning, I was raw. The air smelled damp, like the storm clouds that had gathered overnight. I drank coffee strong enough to burn, my hands steady only because I forced them to be. That's when the knock came. Not a timid tap, not a neighbor's hesitant knock. No, this was sharp, deliberate, like someone who wanted to be heard. I opened the door to find Sheriff Dawson standing on my porch, his wide-brimmed hat in one hand, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Mr. Walker." His voice was low, polite, but carried weight. "Mind if I come in?" My stomach sank, but I stepped aside. The sheriff walked in slow, scanning the cabin like he was cataloging every detail. He set his hat on the table, then pulled a folded paper from his coat. The HOA filed a formal complaint. They're alleging threats, harassment, and failure to comply with community regulations. Judge signed off on a preliminary enforcement order. He slid the paper across the table. My name was on it, bold, underlined, like a target. I gripped the edge of the table. "So that's it?" Carla snaps her fingers, and the county jumps? Dawson's eyes met mine. "That's not how it works, and you know it. But the paperwork is here. You'll need to respond in court." I shoved the paper back toward him. "I already have a lawyer. He's ready to fight this." The sheriff didn't flinch. He tucked the paper back into his coat. "Good. You'll need him. But listen, off the record, you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Someone out here wants this to end, and not through the courts." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "You need to watch your back." The warning sent a cold shiver crawling up my spine. By the time he left, the storm had broken. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolling across the lake. I stood at the window for a long time, staring at the driveway, half expecting a car to pull in, headlights cutting through the sheets of water. Instead, it was Greg who showed up, soaked to the bone, jacket plastered to his shoulders. He didn't bother knocking, just pushed the door open and collapsed into a chair, panting like he'd run the whole way. "She's moving fast," he gasped. "Carla's telling people you pulled a gun on her. She's saying you threatened her life." I froze. "That never happened." "I know," Greg said quickly. "But she's got folks believing it. She even brought up that time you chased off trespassers with a shotgun years back. Twisted the story until it sounded like you were waving it around at everyone." My fists clenched so tight my knuckles popped. "She's not just trying to find me anymore. She's trying to paint me as dangerous, unstable." Greg nodded grimly. "Exactly. And once that sticks, no jury, no judge, no sheriff will take your side." I paced the room, every step fueled by rage. "So what do I do? Sit here and let her bury me alive?" Greg's voice cracked. "No, you fight. Harder than ever. But you've got to be smart. No more shouting. No more letting her push you over the edge. You need to flip the story." The storm raged outside, rattling the cabin like the world itself was shaking apart. I grabbed the phone and called my lawyer. His voice was calm, steady, the one lifeline in the chaos. "We'll file a counterclaim," he said. "Defamation, harassment, trespass. I'll subpoena the realtor, the deputy, anyone who can back you up. The board isn't untouchable. Carla thinks she's clever, but arrogance is her weakness." For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of paperwork, late-night strategy calls, and whispered conversations with neighbors who were finally, cautiously, willing to admit they'd seen too much. Greg collected statements quietly, slipping papers into my mailbox after dark like we were running some underground rebellion. When the court date came, the whole town seemed to know. The small courthouse buzzed like a hive, the gallery packed with neighbors eager to watch the showdown. Carla swept in wearing a tailored suit, her hair perfect, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She looked like she'd already won. I sat at the defense table, my lawyer beside me, my stomach churning. But when the judge entered, everything shifted. The gavel cracked, and the noise died. This wasn't Carla's boardroom anymore. The HOA's lawyer painted me as a menace, an unhinged loner who threatened peace and safety. Every word twisted, every story exaggerated. They showed photos of my signs, of my locked gate, even my shotgun case, as if each one was evidence of criminal intent. Carla testified, her voice smooth, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. She spoke about fear and safety and protecting the community. She never once slipped, never once hesitated. She was good, too good. But then came the cross-examination. My lawyer rose, calm and steady. "Mrs. Hughes, you said you never invited a realtor to Mr. Walker's property, correct?" "Correct." Her voice was firm. He slid a paper across the bench. "Then how do you explain this email? Sent from your personal account to Sunset Realty, requesting a property tour of Mr. Walker's cabin?" The courtroom gasped. Carla's face tightened. Just a flicker, but it was enough. My lawyer pressed harder, one question after another, each one peeling back the polished veneer until the cracks showed. He called the realtor, who confirmed the contact. He called the deputy, who described the strange call and Carla's evasive answers. Piece by piece, her story unraveled. By the time Greg took the stand, the tide had shifted. He spoke quietly but firmly, telling the court about the sign, about the harassment, about Carla's campaign to push me out. His words carried weight because they came from a man who had tried, for so long, to stay neutral. When it was my turn, I stood, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. I spoke about my cabin, the years I'd spent building it, the sweat, the work, the love poured into every beam. I spoke about the harassment, about the realtor at my gate, about the note that threatened me in the dark. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I just told the truth. The silence afterward was heavier than any storm. The judge leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "This court finds insufficient evidence to support the HOA's claims of threats or harassment. The fines and lien are hereby vacated. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, this court will consider sanctions against the HOA for abuse of authority." The gavel cracked like thunder. Carla's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no sound came out. For the first time, she looked small, brittle, human. The gallery erupted, some in cheers, some in angry mutters, but it didn't matter. For me, it was over. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, warm on my face. Greg clapped me on the shoulder, his smile tired but genuine. "You did it. You stood your ground." I looked back at the courthouse doors, half expecting Carla to burst out, vowing revenge. But they stayed shut. The war she'd waged had ended, not with my ruin, but with her defeat. When I drove back to the cabin, the lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun. My gate stood tall, my sign still nailed firm, a silent declaration that I wasn't going anywhere. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon, listening to the crickets, the rustle of leaves, the quiet peace I'd almost forgotten. The cabin was mine, the fight was done, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my chest. Carla might still lurk in the shadows of the neighborhood, her smile sharp, her eyes cold, but she no longer had her claws in me. The hoe had come for my home, but I was still here, and I wasn't leaving.